In 1886, a single man with fewer than 40 followers had the entire United States Army tied in knots. 5,000 soldiers, a full quarter of the regular U.S. Army, were deployed to chase one Apache leader through the mountains of Mexico and the American Southwest. They chased him for 6 months, and they never caught him. He surrendered on his own terms. That man was Geronimo, and the story of how one people held off the most powerful military force in North America for 25 years is one of the most incredible, heartbreaking, and misunderstood chapters in American history. Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I'm your host, Dustin, and today we're diving deep into the world of the Apache, their origins, their culture, their legendary warriors, and their long, painful struggle to hold on to the land they called home. If you're new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. We cover the real, unfiltered history of the American frontier every week, and you do not want to miss a single episode. Now let's ride. To understand the Apache, you first have to forget everything Hollywood taught you. The word Apache itself comes from the Zuni word Apachu, meaning enemy. But the Apache people called themselves Inde, or Dene, simply meaning the people. There are actually several distinct Apache groups, including the Chiricahua, the Jicarilla, the Western Apache, the Mescalero, the Kiowa Apache, and the Lipan. Each had its own territory, its own customs, and its own story. Some historians consider the Navajo distant relatives, though the tribal identities are distinct. The label Apache became a catch-all term only after European settlers arrived, a pattern that repeated itself across the entire continent. Anthropological evidence tells us that Apache ancestors migrated southward from the northwestern Pacific Coast region sometime between the 13th and 15th centuries. They didn't stay in the canyon country of the Colorado Plateau. Instead, they pushed further south and east, spreading across the southern plains of what we now call Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. By the time Europeans arrived, the Apache were a well-established presence across a vast stretch of the American Southwest. Life for the Apache was defined by movement, skill, and deep spiritual connection to the land. They were primarily a nomadic people, following the great buffalo herds that blanketed the southern plains. The buffalo was everything: food, clothing, shelter. Apache families crafted moccasins, leggings, tunics, and dresses from buckskin and buffalo hide, often decorated with beads and feathers. Their diet centered on buffalo meat, supplemented by berries and plants gathered along their travels. Interestingly, the Apache traditionally avoided fish and bear meat, considering them spiritually impure according to their customs. Apache society was organized around extended family units, each led by the most respected and capable member who served as a chief and advisor. These family groups would come together for social events, religious ceremonies, and, when necessary, for defense. One of the most notable features of Apache society was its matrilineal structure. After marriage, a husband moved in with his wife's family, working and hunting alongside them. Women held significant standing in the community, and the social fabric of Apache life revolved around these extended family networks. Their legal and spiritual code was just as sophisticated as their social structure. The Apache maintained strict laws governing everything from conduct around sacred places to behavior during wartime. Near the Salt Lake, their primary source of salt, hunting and disturbing any living creature were strictly prohibited. This wasn't just superstition. It reflected a deep understanding of balance in nature. Everyone, human or animal, was to have free access to that sacred resource. Warfare was treated as a deeply religious matter. Before any campaign, a formal war council would be held, followed by ceremonial dances involving only confirmed warriors. Becoming a warrior, however, was no easy path. A young man couldn't simply pick up a weapon and call himself a fighter. He had to accompany a war party into the field at least 4 times, serving as a humble attendant, caring for horses, preparing food, anticipating needs without being asked. He had no right to choose his meals, no right to complain, and no right to speak out of turn. Only after all veteran warriors unanimously agreed that he had proven himself hardworking, wise, and brave would he be accepted, and even one dissenting voice could block his entry entirely. That is a higher standard than most professional organizations in the modern world. The Apache's relationship with neighboring peoples before European arrival was largely one of trade and mutual benefit. They exchanged buffalo meat and hides with Pueblo communities in return for agricultural goods and pottery. It was a working system, each group supplying what the other needed. Then the Spanish arrived. Their presence fractured these trade networks almost immediately, disrupting economies and relationships that had taken generations to build. The first real storm clouds on the horizon weren't American, they were Mexican. After Mexico gained its independence from Spain, the Apache's territory fell within Mexican borders. Mexico, however, did not recognize the Apache as the original inhabitants of the land. Conflict became constant and brutal. By the 1840s, the Apache faced an existential threat as Mexican military campaigns grew more aggressive and systematic. Into this volatile world, Geronimo was born. His true name was Goyahkla, meaning he who yawns in the Chiricahua language, a name that carries a quiet kind of irony given what his life became. He was born near the Gila River in Arizona on June 16, 1829, into the Chiricahua Apache tribe. As a young man, he was not a warrior or a raider. He was a husband, a father, and by all accounts, a man living a peaceful life. That life was about to be shattered. On March 5, 1851, 400 Mexican soldiers attacked an unguarded Apache camp while the men were away negotiating trade. Among those killed were Geronimo's mother, his wife, and his children. When he returned and discovered what had happened, the man described in his own autobiography as lost, purposeless, and consumed with grief, was reborn as something far more formidable. He wrote, "I did not pray. I had no purpose left. And whenever I saw anything to remind me of my former happy days, my heart would ache for revenge." Have you ever heard a moment described that clearly that changed the entire course of history? Let us know what you think in the comments. What followed was decades of raids, skirmishes, and confrontations, primarily against Mexican forces at first. The Apache proved extraordinarily difficult to subdue. They knew the land intimately, could move silently and quickly across terrain that broke conventional armies, and their warrior culture made them fearless in the face of overwhelming numbers. Things grew dramatically more complicated in the 1840s and 50s as the United States entered the picture. Following the Mexican-American War, the U.S. acquired an enormous stretch of the Southwest, land the Apache had lived on since long before either Mexico or Spain had ever set foot there. From the Apache perspective, Mexico had no right to hand over land that wasn't Mexico's to give. But that legal subtlety meant nothing to the waves of American settlers who now began pushing westward. The settlers came for different reasons. Some were German immigrants fleeing economic hardship in Europe, traveling by covered wagon with everything they owned. Others were miners chasing gold and silver, driven by visions of instant wealth. As mining operations expanded, they encroached deeper and deeper into Apache territory. Suspicion hardened into hostility. Hostility hardened into violence. And the cycle fed itself, growing worse with every passing season. By 1861, the pressure had reached a breaking point. A conflict that had been simmering erupted into open warfare. Geronimo, who had already spent a decade fighting Mexican forces, now found himself at the center of a new and far larger struggle against the expanding United States government and the settlers flooding into the Southwest. The violence of this era touched civilians on all sides, and it is important to understand the full picture. In April 1871, a horrific event known as the Camp Grant Massacre saw a group of vigilantes led by a man named William Ory attack a peaceful Apache settlement, killing more than 100 Apache women and children. The event provoked widespread outrage across the country and became a turning point. It forced the U.S. government to shift its approach, away from pure military pressure and toward a reservation system that promised Native Americans a permanent, protected home. By 1872, major Apache groups, including the Chiricahua, had been assigned reservations on their ancestral homelands in Arizona. The Chiricahua Reservation was located in southeastern Arizona near Fort Bowie, and for a brief period, something remarkable happened. Former enemies, Apache people and U.S. soldiers, actually began forming genuine friendships. The Chiricahua had hunting grounds, access to water, and the mountains they called home. They were content. There was real peace. That peace didn't last. By 1876, a new federal policy emerged that would unravel everything. The government decided to consolidate all Arizona Apache groups onto a single reservation at San Carlos, closing the Chiricahwa's beloved homeland reservation and forcing them to relocate. The commander at Fort Bowie warned explicitly that this decision would lead to war. He was right. San Carlos was, by nearly every account, a miserable place. Dusty, flat, hot, and arid. It was the complete opposite of the forested mountain homeland the Chiricahua had known their entire lives. Indian agents there were frequently disinterested in their welfare. Supplies meant for the Apache were often stolen before they even arrived. Soldiers treated the Apache with contempt and disrespect. For a people whose entire spiritual and cultural identity was tied to specific mountains, rivers, and landscapes, being relocated to San Carlos wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a form of slow erasure. Geronimo refused to go quietly. Along with around 400 fellow Chiricahua, he escaped into Mexico, where his resistance gained widespread attention. He reportedly declared, "We will not yield our land. We will fight to defend it." What followed was a period of raids, pursuits, negotiations, and broken promises that would define the next decade. The U.S. Army struggled to contain the situation. The Chiricahua were masters of guerrilla movement. They could cover enormous distances on foot, survive in terrain that defeated conventional soldiers, and vanish into the mountains when pursued. Geronimo's reputation grew to almost mythic proportions, to the point where virtually every Apache raid in the region was attributed to him, whether he was involved or not. He was eventually captured once, not by soldiers, but by Apache police working with an Indian agent who tracked him to New Mexico. He was brought in chains to San Carlos. It was the first and only time he was captured by force. After 2 years at San Carlos, the Chiricahua were relocated again, this time to the neighboring Fort Apache Reservation. It seemed like the land conflict might be settling, but then a new pressure emerged, a native religious movement that the Army viewed as threatening to Apache traditions. And their response to it, including the killing of an influential medicine man, destroyed whatever fragile trust remained. Geronimo and the principal chief Naiche fled again to Mexico's Sierra Madre mountains with several hundred followers, and the cycle began once more. The U.S. Army eventually assigned General George Crook to resolve the situation. Crook was a different kind of officer. He believed in treating the Apache with respect, honoring commitments, and using negotiation alongside military pressure. He also understood that white soldiers alone would never be able to locate the Chiricahua in their own territory. He relied heavily on Apache scouts, men who knew the land as well as Geronimo himself. With a guide named Peaches leading the way, Crook's force entered the Sierra Madre after 40 days of searching and located the Chiricahua encampment. Crook promised better conditions on the reservation. Geronimo and the others agreed to return. That lasted less than 2 years. By early 1886, Geronimo and roughly 100 others had broken away again, finding reservation life under the existing conditions completely unworkable. Crook met with Geronimo at Cañon de los Embudos for what would become a famous series of negotiations. Crook, remarkably, came without troops. Geronimo expressed his desire to put the past behind him and hold those responsible for wrongdoing accountable. Crook presented a simple choice: surrender or face permanent pursuit. They reached a compromise. Geronimo's group would surrender and go into exile from the Southwest for 2 years, after which they could return to the reservation. Then everything fell apart again, not because of Geronimo, but because of a rogue civilian who approached his camp and told him he would be hanged for murder the moment he set foot in Arizona. Whether this information was accurate or deliberately designed to sabotage the peace, the result was the same. Geronimo and Naiche slipped south into the Sierra Madre with a small group, and the war resumed. General Crook reported the development to his superior, General Sheridan, who expressed frustration and ordered a change in strategy. Crook, after 8 years of difficult work in the region and a firm belief that his approach was the only one likely to actually succeed, requested relief from his command. He stepped aside, and the responsibility for ending the Apache conflict fell to General Nelson Miles. Miles took an entirely different approach. He deployed 5,000 soldiers, a quarter of the entire U.S. regular army, with modern equipment and communication technology, including signal stations to track Apache movements. He believed that sheer pressure and technological advantage would force a surrender. For 6 months, his massive force chased Geronimo's small band, which numbered fewer than 40 people, including women and children. They never caught him. Geronimo and his fighters used their intimate knowledge of the terrain, water sources, and movement patterns to stay one step ahead of thousands of soldiers. The cost was real. Soldiers were wounded in skirmishes along the way, but the Chiricahua remained free. By the late summer of 1886, exhaustion was finally setting in, not defeat, but sheer physical and emotional exhaustion. Word reached Fort Apache that Geronimo might be open to surrender talks. 2 Chiricahua men, Cayita and Martin, were employed as Army scouts to make contact. Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, who knew Geronimo personally, accompanied them. Cayita and Martin tracked the small band to a stronghold in the Torres Mountains, about 50 miles south of the border. They separated from Gatewood and climbed alone to where the group was hiding. Cayita's grandfather, acting as a lookout, spotted them approaching carrying a white flag and recognized them as their own people. After lengthy internal debate, because there were strict instructions not to allow approach, Geronimo and Naiche agreed to meet Gatewood by the river. Gatewood delivered the terms bluntly, and then he told them something that changed everything. Their families at Fort Apache, the women, the elderly, the children, had already been loaded onto wagons and trains and sent to Florida as prisoners of war. The people they had been fighting to protect were already gone. Geronimo's small band held a meeting among themselves. They concluded that they could not endure seeing more of their people taken, more lives lost in an unending pursuit. On September 4th, 1886, Geronimo surrendered at Skeleton Canyon in southeastern Arizona, marked by a pile of rocks. 25 years of Apache warfare in the American Southwest came to an end. It should have been the beginning of a new chapter. Instead, it was the beginning of a different kind of suffering. Geronimo, Naiche, and their group were loaded onto a train and transported to Fort Bowie, and then, shockingly, to Florida. This violated the terms of surrender that General Crook had negotiated. Promises had been made. Those promises were broken. Making this betrayal even more bitter, the Chiricahua scouts who had guided the army to Geronimo, including Qaeda and Martin, who had personally risked their lives to initiate contact, were also imprisoned. Men who had served the U.S. Army faithfully were sent into exile alongside the very people they had helped to capture. Arizona's politicians pushed hard for this outcome. They wanted the Chiricahua gone, as far away as possible. St. Augustine, Florida became their first destination. Around 400 people were crowded into Fort Marion, while the warriors, including Geronimo, were held separately at Fort Pickens in western Florida. The contrast to their southwestern homeland was brutal. Florida's humid heat, its dense and unfamiliar landscape, and the overcrowded, unhealthy conditions in the forts took a severe toll. Illnesses like malaria and tuberculosis tore through the Chiricahua community. People died regularly. Many Apache children were separated from their parents and sent to the Indian school at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where their hair was cut, they were dressed in Western clothing, and they were prohibited from speaking their language. Tuberculosis ran through the school as well, and many children never came home. After years in Florida, conditions forced another relocation to Mount Vernon Barracks near Mobile, Alabama. It was marginally better in some ways, but the stagnant, humid air and the confined space remained a sharp contrast to the open mountain country the Chiricahua had known. Their homeland existed now only in memory. By 1896, they were moved again, this time to land at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, offered by the Comanche and Kiowa. The arrival was deeply emotional. According to accounts from those who were there, the sound of coyotes calling in the night brought many of the Apache to tears, a sound from home, from a world they had been torn away from. At Fort Sill, they found some degree of stability for the first time in a decade. They worked with cattle, they had space, and they had each other. It wasn't home, but it was livable. Geronimo spent the last 23 years of his life at Fort Sill. History rarely offers clean endings, and his story is no exception. He became a well-known public figure, invited to appear at fairs and Wild West shows across the country, where curious Americans paid to catch a glimpse of the man who had humbled the U.S. Army. He attended President Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration in 1905. He even sold autographed photographs to earn money. Naiche, the true Chiricahua chief, converted to Christianity. Geronimo continued practicing his traditional Apache ceremonies and healing rituals, though he admitted in his later years that his belief in his own protective powers had faded with age. In February of 1909, after a night out during which he had been drinking, Geronimo fell from his horse and spent the night on the cold ground. He developed pneumonia and died a few days later at approximately 80 years of age. Some accounts suggest that toward the end of his life, he expressed regret at having surrendered, and that he wished he had died fighting in his native land, rather than living out his years as a spectacle in someone else's country. Whatever the truth of that, he died as a prisoner of war, still technically in U.S. Army custody, on land that was not his own. The Chiricahua story did not end with Geronimo. In 1913, 27 years after surrendering, the Chiricahua were finally released from captivity. But they could not return to their Arizona homeland, which had become part of the Fort Sill Army base. They were given a choice: stay in Oklahoma or relocate to the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. 82 people chose to remain in Oklahoma. 187 made the journey to New Mexico, joining the Mescalero Apache who had supported them during their years of resistance. It was a fresh start, but the wound never fully closed. Many Chiricahua made pilgrimages back to Arizona in later years, back to Skeleton Canyon and its pile of rocks, to honor the memory of their ancestors and grieve the land that was taken from them. Today, the Apache people are very much alive. The largest Apache populations live in Oklahoma, Arizona, California, and New Mexico. They maintain tribal governments, cultural programs, language preservation efforts, and deep community ties. The Chiricahua identity never disappeared. Not through the Florida prisons, not through the Alabama barracks, not through the Oklahoma exile, not through the Carlisle school or the tuberculosis or the broken treaties. It endured. What does the Apache story mean for us today? It is a story about what happens when two completely different worldviews about land, ownership, and survival collide without mutual understanding. It is a story about how a group of people with extraordinary skill, resilience, and courage were ultimately overwhelmed not because they were weak, but because the forces arrayed against them were simply too vast. And it is a story about the cost of broken promises, because the Apache placed their word above almost everything, and they expected the same from those who negotiated with them. Geronimo was not the savage of dime novels and Hollywood westerns. He was a man who lost everything he loved to violence, who spent 35 years fighting to reclaim some version of the world that had been taken from him, and who ultimately had to watch everything he had defended pass beyond his reach. That is a profoundly human story, and it deserves to be told honestly. So, after everything you've heard today, what stands out to you most? Is it Geronimo's personal transformation from peaceful family man to the most wanted leader in the Southwest? The extraordinary skill of Apache warriors who held off 5,000 soldiers? Or the deeply sad irony of Cayeta and Martin, the scouts who brokered the surrender, being imprisoned alongside the men they helped capture? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. These conversations are how we keep this history alive, and I read every single one. If you enjoyed today's episode, hit that like button. It genuinely helps us reach more people who care about real frontier history. Subscribe if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode of Frontier Uncensored. We've got more stories coming that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the American West.